think most people would struggle to tell you what artificial intelligence is. Something that I've been grappling with, right? Here we go. This is something I can't decide on or not. Is AI intelligent? So they killed the AI project because of bias, but actually that's a reflection of your organizational bias as well. Should you use ChatGPT if you were looking up a recipe? Probably not. I would never put my CV into one of these models. This information is now out of your control. I can get a phone call pretending to be from the CEO of my company, and it sounds like him. It obviously makes some banking systems a lot more insecure where they're using your voice as your password.
What can we start to do from now to embed those ethical AI practices into their strategy?
I have been thinking a lot about this, and frankly, some of it terrifies
me. AI is here to take all our jobs, myth or fact?
To be seen.
To be seen. Hello and welcome back to the Business Backstage. It is the podcast where we take you behind the scenes of the tech world to spotlight the people, the practices, and the perspectives that shape and power great organizations. I am your host, Bukola Osuntuyi. And now, if you have ever felt like artificial intelligence is fast moving and also a bit intimidating and scary for me sometimes. So if you feel that way, trust me, you're not alone. And today we are diving straight into that tension because the rapid rise of tools like Google's Veo and OpenAI Sora I think it's made things clear that we are entering into a new era where seeing is no longer believing, right? And where the line between innovation and responsibility is now razor thin. So the big question becomes, is your organization leading AI? Or is AI leading you? And my guest today is someone whose work sits right at the heart of this question. So Tim Clarke is a technologist and is driven by a real passion for bridging the gap between humans and machines. Now, he started out working internationally in the oil industry and navigating the high pressure environments and solving really big problems. And today, his focus is on natural language processing and knowledge graphs, which are technologies that help us to understand and organize information in smarter ways. Tim has an academic background that spans religious anthropology and data science. Yes, you heard that right.
Very true.
So he brings a refreshingly human lens to the complexities of artificial intelligence. Tim, it is a pleasure to have you here as a guest. Thank you so much for making
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be on it. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
Awesome. Fantastic. I think that one of the reasons that I was bent on having you as a guest is because of the first impression that I had of you. And that was at the data event that was hosted by Surya and her team. So when I met you, you struck me as someone who will be a great lecturer because of, yeah, seriously, because of how well you were able to break down very, complex concepts about LLM hallucination, right? You were able to break it down into something that even non-technical folks could understand. And even a day or two, I think, after the event, when we chatted, your message to me was centered around your passion, for educating people and organizations about the importance of responsible AI. And what better time to have that conversation than now. So in this episode, we're going to be unpacking what responsible AI is, and we'll talk through the practical things that business leaders need to be thinking about from now. So if you're somebody who is AI curious, or you are AI cautious, or maybe you're somewhere in between, just stick around. There's a lot to learn, and Tim's perspective is one that you would want to hear. So let's dive into it. I think the first thing that I would say is about your career journey. You've been working for about, give or take, maybe 18 years now, and you began your career in the oil and gas industry, right?
Yeah, and that's very true.
You have since moved from there to natural language processing, right? You have worked in the oil and gas for over 10 years, which I'm really curious about. What inspired that shift from oil and gas, and how has your background as a data scientist, as an engineer, as a religious anthropologist influenced your approach to artificial intelligence?
So the most key bit, or one of the most important things getting me into software at all, actually, was a friend of mine explaining to me about how they were mapping the flow of money. to navigate wealth for the HMRC, and I had a bit of a revelation. This was probably about 10 years ago, just how powerful data could be. So they were looking at tips and monitoring tips, and my assumption was that it was to do with tax revenue, and I got told that I was completely wrong, and actually they were more interested in the flow of wealth regionally, and it had a bit of an epiphany for me where I was like, oh my god, actually data is really powerful, and it's not the direct associations, it's the sort of what can be seen as peripheral, and that sort of led me into software and just realize how powerful software is. And then sort of around about the same time was when we started to see the proliferation of technologies around chatbot deployment into Facebook Messenger and so on, and that combined with my background in anthropology, where I would like to understand people. People are really interesting, and cultures are really interesting. And I think this is something that an awful lot of technology people miss, is that, yeah, technology can do whatever you want, but actually what's more critical is the people and understanding people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this all sort of combined together, plus my experience in the oil and gas industry, where I was very fortunate to visit some parts of the world nobody would ever visit, and the importance of data within the energy sector. And it sort of all just came together to create this passion for natural language processing. And I realized that there's so much information in the world. And this is one of the things I love about the internet, is the easy access to information, but there's so much out there that accessing it is a nightmare. I mean, it's like, it's most data is stored in nice tables and so on, but actually, or not most tables, most processed data is stored in nice tables. Most data is in the form of words, text, images. It's not nicely structured. So accessing it and making use of it is incredibly challenging. And that's where technologies like natural language processing and image recognition potentially come in. And then knowledge graphs are something that a bit more recent for me, but they connect the world in a different way to, say, an SQL database, and it allows you to understand the structure of a network. For example, there was a group of academics at an Italian university who predicted who was going to be elected in the recent papal election before the election happened, based on network graphs. There's a couple of technologies there that just help you understand culture, and like I say, that's sort of how I ended up where I am.
Amazing. So I would still want to touch on your background in human behavior, which is anthropology, religious anthropology. How do you see that intersection of human behavior and AI development, especially in the workplace?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to that point that I made earlier, that, well, I think there's a couple of aspects here. So firstly, I'm fairly hopeful. I like to believe about AI. I'm relatively optimistic about it. And I think if we manage it right, it's going to be, talking about sort of augmentation as opposed to replacement. And that's the way I really hope the situation evolves. But there's also, in terms of introducing AI into the workplace, you have to consider people. People are the core of any business. And if that's not done right, you're going to hit a problem. You've got to have, you've considered the culture of your workplace, identify those key influences and influencers within an organization who can either support, hinder, or resist your implementation. It's also making sure that people aren't afraid. Now, I would say that most people have a legitimate reason to be fearful of AI. And there's an idea that they're going to be replaced, or maybe they just don't understand. But introducing any new technology, you're always going to have that degree of resistance, and helping people understand what the benefits are, that they're not under threat, and supporting them in some form of transition is really fundamental to this, where AI meets human beings. Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. We have the parts where some people are, scared of it and they're not really welcoming of that idea. And then we also have the technologists, the ones who are driving this innovation. And we would tend to see some, bias sometimes in the models that are being developed. And I think that bringing that human behavior into how we manage AI, I think it means paying attention to people, right? The people who are
Yes.
designing the technology. I think it's about creating the frameworks that would help those who are designing it to think about their possible biases and
Absolutely.
create a work culture where doing the right thing for society matters, just as much as building something that is impressive. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that this is an important distinction, actually, sort of people's perception of ethics versus actual ethics. And I would say that companies should not just be about themselves. They have a social responsibility that goes wider than just this entity that we call a corporation or whatever. But having said that, something that I actually been wanting to explore properly for a while is this idea of bias. So famously, Amazon tried to develop AI system for recruitment where it would assess CVs. And what happened was that essentially the system said, if you're a woman, we're not going to employ you.
Oh my gosh.
So they killed it, right? So because it was picking up on peripheral things like, were you captain of the women's football team at university, or were you competing gymnastics? Just these peripheral indicators, right? So they killed the AI project because of bias. But actually, one of the things that has been sort of scooting around my head for quite a while is that's a reflection of your organizational bias as well. So if there's AI comes from the data that you feed into it, right? So you can control and manipulate it and produce the patterns you want to generate. If you're feeding in data and it's producing something that you are uncomfortable with, maybe you need to look at your organizational practices as well. So I think it's like a mirror, and I think that's really interesting and something that isn't talked about as much as I would like. So the biases that get into AI come from biases that exist in the data, which then comes from somewhere. You need to think about where that somewhere is.
Now, I want us to go to the topic that we're discussing, which is, around responsible AI. So we get to hear, a lot about responsible AI on, the internet, the media. So in your words, what does responsible AI mean?
That's really difficult. That's really difficult. I think there's two broad areas here. There's AI for good, where you're actively using AI to benefit the world. However, what most companies talk about when they talk about responsible AI is AI for not bad. So they're not causing harm.
Okay.
And that is, I think, is a critical distinction. If using AI for not bad means that you are maintaining the status quo, you're not, for example, I can't remember the name of the company, but they deployed an AI system in the US that was to do with granting or assessing parole and your chances of being given parole if you're of certain ethnicities was significantly lower than for others. In another system deployed in healthcare, white patients were being given, or they were intervening earlier than black patients or African American patients. There's a problem there because the intention is good, the outcome is not as good. And so it's about having not just a governance framework but you looking at how you do it, but also what you're doing. So it's the governance framework and the content. So what you're trying to achieve, are you achieving what you want? And just constantly assessing it. I've been reading Reed Blackman's book on ethical machines recently, and he sort of says that most people think ethics are sort of squishy and subjective. And his argument is they're not. Our perception of ethics is subjective, and what we think is ethical, and our beliefs about ethics are subjective. Ethics themselves are hard and fast. You should be looking at, the ethical implementation and this, but it's not just about is something good or bad, it's the benefit they'll bring to the business or bring to an organization. And if you're more than just compliant, you've got reputational benefit, you've got the way you're perceived, and people know that you're a good company. It brings a lot of advantages. A bit like good branding or successful branding, it's got to be part of that whole sphere. But it's not easy, and it's not. Especially when you start to look beyond just the data and so on. So there's thinking about energy use as well and water consumption and resources. So should you use ChatGPT if you were looking up a recipe? Probably not. it's easier to Google, it's way more energy efficient, it's so on. So should you jump straight to AI? Well, firstly, do you need it? What's the advantages? Secondly, is there a better way or easier way of doing it or a less resource intensive way of doing it? The answer is probably yes. It's sort of quite complex, but it's an interesting area, and you've just got to have your governance framework there.
Yeah, I was reading an article. I think it was by United Nations University or so, and it was an article about that link between the human behavior and AI governance. And they said something which was interesting. They said that it's much harder to change a person who holds a biased view than it is to fix an AI system that shows bias.
Yeah,
So
completely.
to make AI better, we still need people to act responsibly, right? By applying like the best practices, using data rights, and designing those systems. So yeah, it's complex, and there are a lot to consider when it comes to governance and leading.
Yeah, it is. But it's interesting because I was up until very recently, I've been really keen on additional regulation around AI. Can't remember which podcast I was listening to, but they were discussing the idea of not having additional AI regulation, and I was like, that doesn't make sense at all. Why would you do that?
We need that.
I was like, we need it, but the argument was that if you're committing fraud is wrong and illegal. The way of delivery, the method of delivery is irrelevant. So if you're doing something which is already managed within our legal framework that is against the rules, then you have committed a crime. The fact that you're doing it with AI is irrelevant. And I was like, actually, that's really interesting. So it does make me, and it's one of the things I've been thinking about in relationship to this podcast, because when we're looking at implementation and how do you protect yourself and how do you keep your business safe and build for better, does it really change using AI? Because cybersecurity best practices are there already, and actually, like you read around, sort of protecting yourself from security vulnerabilities using like deepfakes and like some technologies you mentioned in the opening. Does that really change? Well, yeah, I can get a phone call pretending to be from the CEO of my company and saying, and it sounds like him, or a Teams message or whatever. But best practice says that I should go back and confirm and make sure by a confirmed route. Does that change? And you look at the way that social engineering is carried out by on various attack vectors in cybersecurity. Does it change because it's AI? Well, probably not. Our response, I think, is still the same. And we're probably going to see a lot more of it. I mean, I think that's for certain.
Okay.
Because it's easier. I mean, the price of generating some seriously good deepfake voice is peanuts. So we're probably going to see more of it. It obviously makes some banking systems a lot more insecure where they're using your voice as your password. But the best practice, I think, at its core is probably going to remain very similar to what it is now.
Okay. So we're still going to talk more about this and more in depth. And I want us to move to the practical side, which is with organizations. I mean, still in relation to what we just talked about. One thing that we're seeing is some companies would only start to think about ethics, AI ethics more seriously, maybe when something goes wrong, right? So whether it's a regulatory warning or a reputational blow up. So for instance, just like you mentioned cybersecurity, sometimes it's only when there's been a cyber attack, that some companies will begin to build or maybe to make what they have much stronger. They have more stronger systems that can control the risks in the future. But ideally, these conversations should be happening before that point. So for leaders who genuinely want to get ahead of the curve, what can we start to do from now to embed those ethical AI practices into their strategy?
So, okay, I think it's wider than that. I think my personal opinion is there's a huge social issue here, where there is a massive misunderstanding or lack of education about artificial intelligence. So it's easy to say, but it starts with like education, regardless of whether you're in a business or you're in the community, educating people about AI effectively, what it is. I mean, I think most people would struggle to tell you what artificial intelligence is. At its core, artificial intelligence is pattern recognition at a scale that we just cannot do. What's brought it about is rapid changes in the price of compute, making data easier to feed into algorithms, some of which were developed back in the 50s. And most people don't realize that artificial intelligence is already shaping the way that we live. I mean, some form of AI machine learning system is going to be used to protect your inbox for emails. It's going to be used for those vouchers that you get at the supermarket. It's going to be used when you're choosing something on Netflix. It's every little thing you're doing. You're part of that sort of pattern recognition and saying, you want to do something? Well, I think you'll like this, or this will be better for you, or whatever. So starting there and just saying, look, it's there. The other thing is educating people about what AI is. And I don't mean, it's not about going into the specific algorithm. The man in the street does not need to know what a decision tree is, or how a neural network works, or the intricacies of an LLM and generation. What they need to know is these are the tools available. So this is one of the things with large language models is I'm ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, etc. Great, they're really useful tools, and I use them a lot. But I don't put anything personal about me in. I would never put my CV, for example, into one of these models, especially not the free ones. I wouldn't put anything about my business into the free ones. So if I want to do something to get an idea, I will use a scenario that I've created elsewhere in my head and said, look, this sort of simulates what I want to do. Pop it in and then adapt the output. And I don't directly you've got to think about it, because this information is now out of your control. So educating people can stay in control of what they put in, and getting them familiar with the tools and comfortable, and just creating an atmosphere of, I suppose, experimentation almost, and support. Because a lot of organizations are just putting down the shutters, and I don't think that's the right approach either. And again, coming back to that, what I mentioned before about laws, your IT policy, well, it should be good enough to cover the use of AI. Nothing's changed. The inappropriate use of AI is still inappropriate use of IT equipment, and so on. But then there's a sort of an element of trust as well.
Yes.
So you need to trust your people to do that, which is really difficult. I mean, there's some organizations don't have the culture to do that. And will they change? I mean, we've already mentioned it's more difficult. It's really difficult to change behaviors. In a nutshell, education and experimentation.
Awesome.
And that's the two things that will help you stand in the right step for AI development.
Education and experimentation. Thank you so much. So if you are enjoying this conversation, don't forget to subscribe to Business Backstage and share the episode with a colleague, share it with a business owner, somebody who's thinking about AI and leadership. We're just getting started. Still about what we're talking about. I want to move to the risks, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about something that's been, making the headlines lately. We talked about it previously. Tools like Google View, OpenAI's Sora. These are incredibly powerful and honestly quite mind-blowing tools when you see what they can generate. This hyper-realistic, videos, the entire scene that just looks completely real, but it's entirely AI generated. So on one hand, it's quite exciting, right? It's like an exciting leap of creativity and innovation. But on the other hand, it raises, serious concerns. We're talking about, just you mentioned, right? You could watch a video of a CEO who is saying something, and this thing never happened. Yet it looks so convincing enough to influence millions of people. So from your own perspective, Tim, what are those most pressing risks that you see emerging from these kinds of technologies?
This was one of the things that we discussed, and I have been thinking a lot about this. Frankly, some of it terrifies me, and this I think ability to create a scenario that has never existed. How do you manage that? And I think this is, again, sort of coming back to the cybersecurity best practice. It needs to be part of your response plan, is responding to a deep fake. Very easy to let these things get away from you, but you need to nip them in the bud. How do you prove it's a deep fake? It's very challenging. I mean, yeah, there's talk about putting in some form of watermark into AI generated content. Okay, great. But the people who are doing this are not going to be doing it on legitimate tools. It'll probably be dark web of some sort. So is it going to be AI watermark in there? I'd be
Get
skeptical.
an AI tool that, clears off the watermark.
Yeah. Exactly. So how do you manage it? I wish I had a good answer for it, but I don't. And it's such an evolving, changing situation. I mean, you think back to a year ago, and the images and the videos, they weren't quite right. There was something about them, six fingers, for example.
Exactly.
Classic things. But now the not right things are more detailed. So if you look into detail in the picture, you'll see it, but it's not as obvious as well. So this is an interesting thing, actually. As the model evolves, it's going to get better, you assume. However, something that not many organizations, or I'm not seeing talked about it as much as I would like, is the idea of model collapse. Okay. So as you generate, as more and more of the data that the model's getting trained on is AI generated, it's going to establish different patterns. Eventually, there was a team, I think it was at Cambridge University, who accelerated this process. And after a certain number of generations, suddenly the image quality literally fell off a cliff. Like, it just was like, hey, good, smash. And that's because it was being recursively trained on AI-generated content.
Okay.
Now, is that going to happen wider? Because we're starting to see more and more AI-generated content on the internet, which is, the source of the data for training models. Yes. Like ChatGPT and VO and so on. Is that going to happen? That will be interesting. So we'll probably see an increase in quality, and then it'll finally stagnate. And then is it going to drop off a cliff? Possibly. But, there are people smarter than me working on this problem, I would hope.
Yeah.
OpenAI is quite close. How do you manage it? I've not got a clue apart from being on it.
It's really complex. And just like you said, we are still experimenting, the innovation is still developing. Even back to what we talked about, what you feed the data, being mindful of what you feed the data. I think it's quite challenging even for organizations, because you can have all the frameworks or you can have the best practices, but then you also have the external customers who can feed, the machines with your own data. For instance, I could be preparing for an interview and I'll just go, copy maybe all the job description and everything. And there are certain things in the job description that is internal, for internal knowledge. And I could just feed the system with that. And the machine takes that. So how do you manage that on the external side?
Well, this is part of the sort of what I'm talking about, it being a social issue. And this is my very, very much my personal view, is that if you are knowledgeable in this subject, you have, I don't want to say obligation, that's a bit strong, but it would be beneficial for society as a whole to share that knowledge with other people. It's because I'm very worried about the fact that we're going to end up with an elite section of society who have a real understanding of what is going on, how these tools work, and then there's going to be everybody else. And if we want to hold that section of society accountable, we need to educate ourselves. And I think that's been true whatever the topic is through the ages. Is an educated society and a knowledgeable society is beneficial for all. So conversations like the one that we're having right now, I think, are almost invaluable to sort of spreading that message and spreading just a little bit of knowledge, and it starts to accumulate and people have a better understanding. It gives them the ability to question as well. Why are you doing that? Why are you pursuing artificial general intelligence? As a society, we didn't ask you to do that, and hold people accountable. Yes. And it is knowledge that allows you to do that, I believe.
Yes, I agree with that. Fantastic. So let's talk about leadership for a moment.
Yeah.
Especially for people who are not tech, savvy, or maybe they don't have a technical background. right? So not every CEO or a manager would understand the ins and the outs, of how AI works, but the executives, they still have that huge influence on how AI is used across the business. So how can the leadership set the right tone for responsible AI adoption, even if they don't have deep technical expertise?
Again, I think that comes back to what I was saying earlier: education and experimentation. So I appreciate it's difficult, especially if you're in a very senior leadership position. You might not have time. Firstly, I believe going forward that one of the most critical roles, in any organization is going to be a translator role. So someone who understands what the organization does, but also has that technical. And it doesn't have to be deep, but it has to be enough so that they can communicate with the deeply technical people to understand what's going on. And I think that role is going to become more and more invaluable as technology accelerates. So having a team around you who is able to communicate well and share complex ideas or deeply technical ideas simply, absolutely invaluable. The other thing is allowing that sort of culture of experimentation education to flourish. I've been doing a lot of thinking about leadership recently as well. And I think there's a differentiation we need to make here between leadership and management. So just to demonstrate leadership doesn't mean you have to be a senior manager in an organization or a VP or whatever. You can, So this, and I think, again, this is something that most organizations don't get right, is leadership is very much tied to that hierarchy. But actually, if you can encourage a culture where leadership is leadership, regardless of what your role in the organization is, you can then take things forward, or you can push things and ideas and concepts without being, senior management. So comes down to culture and allowing people to explore and educate and share that knowledge as well. So it's not about knowledge accumulation; it's about educating.
Educating.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Finally, for my last question on this section, and just really quickly, is artificial intelligence is changing how we work. So from where you sit as somebody who is an NLP specialist right now, how do you see AI reshaping the future of work, not just in tech roles, but across industries?
It's going to make us way more efficient. You have no doubt about that.
A good start.
Yep. The thing that we need to realize, and this is absolutely critical, is if you look at where technology is now, this is the floor, right? This is entry level, getting on board. We're only going to go that way. And I genuinely believe that. I wouldn't like to guess at a timescale, which is partly why I'm quite strongly a strong proponent of regulation. I think sort of ignoring what I said earlier about there are laws in place. The artificial intelligence is creating an area where there's potentially unexplored, and I don't think that our legislative authorities and governments are actually placed well enough to react quickly. So something needs to be done there. So this is the floor. So entry-level positions, we're already seeing an effect on entry-level positions. So you need to think differently about the way that you work when you're getting in on board. The mindless, repetitive tasks that you get the most junior person in the office to do, they are going to be handed over to some sort of system soon enough. That said, fully autonomous AI system, I think, is a terrible idea, where it has control to do, like agentic AI. Love the idea. I'm a bit nervous about the execution, where it can, interpret and do what it wants with access to tools and the internet. That makes me quite uncomfortable. Yeah, but this is when the ethics and responsibility come into place. Because you, as a company or as an organization, that you need to be feeding that progression as well. So if you start not having your junior team members, where your middlemen and senior leadership going to come from further down the road? And having that, I'm also a big believer in being a subject matter expert. So if you understand a business and you understand what it does, and at least have an understanding of, I don't know, for example, I worked in the energy sector. I'm not necessarily an expert in all parts of the energy sector, but I can talk the language and at least get a rough idea. If people don't get that experience, then what value are you going to have further up the chain as well? And that's where, yeah, okay, AI might be able to support that. Something that I've been grappling with, right? Here we go. This is something I can't decide on or not. Is AI intelligent? Some weeks I think yes, it's intelligent, right? So intelligence is the ability to achieve a complex task. Okay, I think that's a fair definition. So AI is intelligent because it achieves complex tasks. Then other weeks I'm like, well, it's just pattern recognition.
Yeah.
The intelligence comes from the human beings. If you look at NLP models, well, actually what it's coming from is it's a statistical representation of intelligence that has been put there in the data that's been fed. The intelligence comes from human beings. So I swing between these two extremes. So AI is not intelligent. There's no intelligence there at all. AI is intelligent because it can achieve complex tasks. Is it intelligent? I think that's sort of quite fundamental as well. Is where does the intelligence come from? It comes from us. I think I've gone on a bit of a rant here, but off down like a tangent. I didn't mean to.
It sets a good foundation for people who may be scared about it, to really think that, is it intelligent or not? I mean, this thing was, developed by humans. So that sets a good foundation for people to be able to approach it, and handle it responsibly.
Before we sort of get to the end, I think that's the thing that everyone needs to understand about artificial intelligence is pattern recognition at scale based on a lot of computing power. And there's a lot of people out there who will tell you it is more complicated. It's not. It is pattern recognition at scale using different algorithms. Those algorithms are complicated. Concept behind it is not. So once you understand that it's looking for patterns, which is, quite similar to the way we operate, your friendship groups and stuff. We've got there's patterns there of overlapping interests, but it's very simple. And I think anyone that tries to tell you otherwise has an agenda there.
I think you saying that has helped me in a way. I think just putting it that way, simplifying it really, and I think some of my audience would also feel better, just hearing that. All right, Tim, before we wrap up, I want us to switch gears a bit for a quick fire round. I call it myth or fact. So I'm going to throw out a few questions, just common questions around AI statements, and you're going to tell me what you think, if it is a myth or a fact or maybe somewhere in between. And feel free to add a quick thought if you'd like to.
I'll do my best to add quick thoughts. I'm not good at that. Meandering.
So you can just go myth or fact. That's fine. So my first question, which I think most people will be interested to know. AI is here to take all our jobs, myth or fact?
That's a bit of both. Yeah, so it will take some jobs, for sure. And so quick thought, this isn't a revolution we are seeing. And I see lots of people comparing it to the Industrial Revolution. There is a cognitive element that was not in the Industrial Revolution that is here now. So it's not after the low-skilled jobs either. It's there will be white-collar jobs under threat, for sure. But some of the same principles apply. We have to change the way we think, the way that we do. And hopefully, ideally, we'll end up in a situation where AI does everything and we get to be creative and do what we want. That would be brilliant.
And I think that leads me to my next question for you. Number 2, robots will rule the world. Myth or fact? What are your thoughts?
I'm pretty positive about it. I'm going to say myth, but that said, I don't think it'll be robots. If it does, I think it'll be an AI with access to the internet.
Yeah.
So I hope it doesn't happen. I've generally got pretty positive outlook on where we're going, but there are major caveats to that, and I think that there's a lot of responsibility we have to take to progress that in the way that I would like.
Okay. Number 3, using AI means giving up your privacy. Myth or fact?
Yes, to a certain degree, absolutely. But then this comes back to the education piece. So whenever I'm on a website, disable all the cookies. I never accept cookies. When I'm chatting to ChatGPT, I'm not putting in direct information like I mentioned earlier. I'm putting in simulation. I wouldn't use it for having a conversation with it's a tool for me. And I think that's important as well. You need to recognize it's a tool and be considerate about what you're putting into it. That way you can control your privacy.
My final question. AI will replace creativity.
I really struggle with this one. I don't think so. So it comes back to what I was saying earlier about where does intelligence come from? Okay, so the intelligence in AI systems at the moment, I genuinely believe, comes from human beings most of the time. So it's because people have already created that and it's replicating. It's creating a statistical representation of what is most likely to be. Will it replace creativity? To be seen.
To be seen. I like that conclusion. Thank you so much, Tim. So that is it for today's episode of Business Backstage, and a massive thank you to Tim Clarke for joining me,
Pleasure.
sharing such thoughtful, grounded insights into the world of responsible AI. I think it's clear that the conversation around AI is not just technical, it is cultural, it is ethical, it is deeply human. So if today's episode left you with questions, if it left you with reflections, or even a spark of curiosity, I'd love to hear from you. So reach out via LinkedIn or Instagram, Business Backstage. And how can we contact you, Tim, if we need more information?
Oh, probably LinkedIn's the best way. I'm always happy to nerd out about things if anyone fancies a chat as well. As you've probably guessed, I like thought experiments. I like to explore ideas. So yeah, please feel free, drop me a line on LinkedIn.
You would find Tim D. Clarke on LinkedIn. And if this episode resonated, please subscribe for more content like this and leave a comment wherever you are listening from. So thank you so much for watching. I am Bukola Osuntuyi, and I'll see you on the next episode of Business Backstage. And until then, take care.